Welcome to the 19th annual Martin and Doris Rosen Summer Symposium and to our first pre-recorded lecture on the topic of destroying democracy, building dictatorship, the Nazi movement, and the youth. I'm Thomas Pegelow Kaplan. I'm the Leon Levine Distinguished Professor of Judeo-Holocaust and Peace Studies, the director of the center by that name, and also the co-director of this Rosen Symposium. I'm very much looking forward to be working with all of you in the course of this week, and hopefully, of course, also beyond. In recent years, our symposia have focused on a specific overarching topic. This year, it is on children in the Shoah, continuing our earlier exploration. The last time we were able to hold it. Last year, unfortunately, we had to postpone it due to the COVID outbreak, continuing our exploration of education in Nazi Germany. We always strive for balance and therefore try to combine this more specific focus with also more of a broader and background-oriented exploration of relevant materials, be it, of course, the fundamentals of Judaism, be it manifestations and conceptualization of anti-Semitism, or, of course, the rise of German fascism, which, of course, in many ways is the topic for this pre-recorded lecture. The overall, of course, agenda for this presentation, as well as for the entire week, is, of course, to give you more tools, ways, means, information, various conceptualization to help you do an even better job in the classroom. And if we only, in fact, accomplish that to a little extent, we have already done quite a bit here. So the overarching topic then, let me start doing some screen share here as well. Our overarching topic then, go back to the beginning of destroying democracy and building dictatorship is, of course, studied and also taught quite differently in recent years than it has been even 10 years ago. It is in many ways no longer the kind of reassurance of the superiority of liberal democracy that we had at the end of the Cold War. Of course, will now take us back to the 1990s, but rather, in fact, is carried out in the context of profound threats and also challenges to liberal democracy in this era of right-wing populism and liberalism in which we find ourselves in. It has taken hold, of course, on a global scale from Hungary to Brazil to the Philippines and, of course, beyond, but also, stop sharing for now, also in the United States itself. I remember distinctly a lecture I attended at the Van Leer Institute, which is, for those who have been or nearby, near the residence of, by now, former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, at the heart of Jerusalem back in December of 2017. Simon Sharma was lecturing, a professor specialist in Dutch and French history at Columbia University, and proclaiming broadly that the study of Nazism now had to unfold differently, that Trump had become president, and in fact that the study of the rise of Nazism had to be carried out with a different sense of urgencies. Historians, he summed up, had simply that obligation. You see it, of course, also in recent days when, like in part of a new, in fact, a revelation of a new book that is coming to the stores before too terribly long. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff General Mark Milley was quoted as labeling Trump as the, quote, classic authoritarian leader with nothing to lose, and going on, pointing to parallels between Hitler's rhetoric as a victim and savior and Trump's false claims of election fraud. And this is again Milley, quote, "This is a Reichstag moment, the gospel of the Führer." So what we of course see throughout is that Nazi comparisons and the instrumentalization of histories of fascism, especially German fascism, and the Holocaust are of course nothing new and rather commonplace. It's done across the political spectrum. I see it in fact also on the right and even far right, where now the Holocaust and policies to in fact fight the pandemic, so COVID-19, of course also just compared, but also equated and quite on vogue. I see it, of course, also many of our students and even some of our colleagues engaging in some of the practice, often, of course, not in the most sophisticated way, to say the very least, with rather crude comparisons of Trump as the new Hitler kind of and the like. Of course, if anything, this reveals the need, what I want to do in the next 25 minutes or so, of taking yet another look at, in fact, the rise of fascism in Germany, and of course the various, in fact, repercussions that also has in the broader, in fact, reflections, on it. So let's then do just that. And with that in mind, let me actually share the screen again. Okay, here we go. Yes. Okay, and so often, of course, also when working with our students, maps can be quite helpful. And I would actually argue in the case of Nazi Germany, this is absolutely no exception. So here, in fact, you have the map of the Weimar Republic. You see, of course, marked the territorial and also population losses as a result of World War I. This, of course, will be one factor we discussed to an extent. But you also, of course, see in color blue the predominance of the state of Prussia, which during the empire, of course, came to mark rather the creation of militarism, authoritarianism, etc., etc. Well, for the Weimar Republic, that was actually quite different. And that's kind of worth to, in fact, stress that for just a second. In fact, Prussia was the bulwark of the democratic parties, the founding parties of the Weimar coalition, from the Social Democrats to the Center Party, the Catholic Party, and also the Liberal Party, the DDP, that in fact founding parties of the Republic, and in many ways then held the power and influence in the state of Prussia all the way to the summer of 1932. So quite an astounding degree of stability. And of course, given the importance of Prussia also throughout the Weimar Republic, this is kind of more than noteworthy. So it's not only, of course, the Republic that was always marred by crisis or whatsoever. There's, of course, much more to that overall. In fact, overall creation and analysis. So let me actually continue here as well. So what we need to then kind of sketch is the evolution, in fact, from what you see here, right? So if you kind of keep it at the level of government for like another minute of the last grand coalition in the Weimar Republic that in fact was in existence from 28 until the early 1930, led by a social democrat. You see him right here at the center, Hermann Müller, good, in fact, traditional social democratic politicians, nothing all too radical at all about that overall party, and again the parties of the Weimar coalition, plus of course also the DVP, so another liberal party, more conservative, of then foreign minister and previous in fact Chancellor Stresemann, who unfortunately dies in office at that time. So how to get from here then is the broader challenge to here. This is of course the iconic image that everybody is familiar, that is in your textbooks kind of and the like, right? So of the minority government led by Hitler that came into being in January of 1933. Much noted, and as of course we all see, is that we only have Hitler as the chancellor, and then two other National Socialists, Frick in the back, Minister of the Interior, and then Göring right here without portfolio. Of course, that changes relatively quickly. Of course, part of the overall Nazi strategy. So how to get there, and of course, what we kind of need in our broader explanation, then are, of course, a number of other steps, including one enshrined by an image of a person like here. A number of you might be even able to identify simply visually, but this is Heinrich Brüning, the in fact chancellor of the Center Party, though the party affiliation is not that critical right here, who is brought in within 3 days of the fall of the Grand Coalition of Müller in March of 1930, and that's of course the key point. He is no longer governing by, in fact, a majority in parliament. He is, in fact, governing by, in fact, the power of presidential decree. It's a presidential cabinet, and that, of course, marks an enormous shift in the history of the Weimar Republic, now happening in the spring of 1930. And there are quite a number of historians, but were even more so, also back in the day, who in fact marked the end of the Weimar Republic, not in fact by, Hitler becoming chancellor, but in fact by the shift to presidential cabinets, like the first one here headed by Brüning in 1930. So then the broader, in fact, overall challenge and part of our exploration here, and let me actually stop sharing again here for now, is then in fact our broader questions, which I would like then to address. And for that, let me actually share the screen again. Okay. Number one, why did the Weimar Republic collapse? How and why was the Nazi and Hitler movement brought to power? And of course, the wording is deliberate. And what was the significant gatekeeping, of course, in the overall context and exploration of our symposium of the youth in these distinct developments? And of course, this is something we'll be exploring throughout the duration of the symposium here. So words, of course, matter. I want to spend another minute on this precisely, since I already set it up in a way, if you wish, by the wording and the questions that I posed. So how, in fact, are we teaching about, the, in fact, end of the Republic and the rise of Nazism? What lingo is used, and what lingo, of course, was used, and what does it tell us about the various dynamics? And I have also here depicted one of the Nazi pamphlets from, in fact, the early fall of 1933, and of course the Nazis were already in government. And you see some of the lingo that is used here, and I use some German here as translation. So the Machteroberung is the term distinctly that you find in that pamphlet. And it kind of goes in many ways hand in hand, similarly to the term of Machtergreifung, the seizure of power, which was, of course, historians have picked up on, and many of you might also be even using in this regard. Strikingly enough, that term was, for the most part, stringently avoided by Nazi propagandists. And it was done for a reason, given, of course, that in the early weeks and months, there was nothing in terms of stability, and nothing, of course, that, came to the overall conclusion that the Nazis would be in government for a longer time. They would successfully establish the dictatorship and the like. So all of that, of course, was carefully, more or less calibrated in this broader context. And the overall, overall fear in terms of Nazi leaders was simply that by indicating like a seizure, like some degree of violence, which of course took place, but of course was in the distinct propaganda and political lingo of the movement, distinctly and deliberately downplayed, would in fact, if anything, not gain the support among the middle classes or even upper middle classes that the party, of course, was after and needed for the continuing process or projected process of dictatorship building, and of course also electioneering in the early stages, of this overall process. So instead, what party leaders were using, in fact, was the Machtübernahme, the assumption of power, which comes with it or conveys a certain degree of legitimacy, a certain degree of continuity, and also a certain degree of peacefulness in the broader process without scaring off, in fact, the more moderate middle classes in this overall context. Nazi propaganda, these are all terms, of course, you have heard before, of course, have been also using related terms like the nationale Erhebung, so the national rising, or even the much more controversial term, at least also among historians in many ways, of a German revolution, a Deutsche Revolution, especially the revolution context is hotly debated. I don't have time to go into great detail now, but of course we can do it during the synchronous session in due time. Now, many historians today, in fact, prefer, unsurprisingly, a different term or different terminologies altogether. And what you see a lot in recent works, also by leading, in fact, scholars, Kolb, Wähler, recently deceased, have been using it, is that of the Machtübergabe, the handover of power, even the Machtübertragung in a similar vein, indicating not so much great Nazi agency as the predominant factor, but in fact of all the various factors that come into play to explain, in fact, the success of the Hitler movement or the Nazi movement in 1933. So with this in mind, then let's in fact take a closer look. And in the following, as I said, at this point, 20 minutes, of course, kind of go through various of those key factors. So instead of presenting a narrative history, which of course you get by Doris Berger, and I hope you had the chance, of course, to read it, one of the 3 books that we assigned here, in fact, for the symposium. Instead, I want to do a more thematic exploration of highlighting some of the key kind of factors here and then fleshing them out a little bit more. And so the broader, of course, issue kind of going into it is that for a while, or in certain readings, also in textbooks, you see almost like an insistence on monocausal models, right? So of picking one or maybe kind of 2 distinct factors to explain it. So you would, of course, see relatively often the resort to economic factors, the word economic crisis, or even also in the context of the lost war. Even some historians, of course, have been talking about our understanding, putting the First and Second World War together, talking about the 30-year civil war in this broader context in Europe and all of it. But overall, and that's of course one of the points I want to make here kind of right away, all of those rather monocausal models are not all that convincing ultimately. Instead, what is necessary is like to resort to a broader complexity of causes of various factors. So what factors then would be important to play up and to highlight? The first one, or first set of factors rather here, I would argue are, of course, those of political crisis and the distinct institutional framework that underpinned it. It's not just the institutional framework, it's of course the distinct way in which the political process evolved. Was quite different in the early months of the Weimar Republic, even compared to the middle years and certainly the final years, even all the way up during the time of Müller's chancellorship from 28 to 30, which is important to keep in mind. So the power of the president is, of course, is the key factor. And I'm going to show you a few graphs. I think one is in German, but nonetheless, I'll walk you through it to hopefully make this a little clearer. So the constitution here is the example of German. So what you see, and that's the key factor here, is in fact the formula of 28, 48, and 53. And what I'm referring to this here is with 25 is in fact the article that allowed the president to dissolve the Reichstag. So here we have the office of the president, here's the Reichstag, so löst auf by dissolve. We have 48, also very important, the emergency paragraph. That played, of course, a key role. And that'll become obvious again in a minute or so, gave the president the power to sign into law emergency bills without the consent of the Reichstag. There's, of course, a certain process in place, right, only like for 60 days, and all of it that could be enacted. So there were some mechanisms in place, but not very strong ultimately. And then 53, also very, very important in this overall context here, namely, is the, in fact, appointment of the Chancellor, of the Reichskanzler right here. So 25, 48, 53, all in all, creates a very, very strong presidency. So to which, of course, later constitutions have all reacted. And it was not, that's of course important too, because one might think like, why would there be such an important, office in terms of the presidency then kind of created in this broader context, almost like a surrogate emperor. But it was actually not so much of a problem in the early years of the Republic. And here, in fact, you see Friedrich Ebert, who was the first president of the Republic, a social democrat. In fact, who played also a key role in the early stages of the German Revolution of 1918, 1990. And you have, in fact, Ebert also using quite frequently, at least for certain periods of time, Article 48, but in the crisis year of 1923. And of course, he did so to stabilize the Republic and not so much to undermine it. This, of course, changes in 1925, when Hindenburg is in fact appointed president. You see him here as Hitler. It's of course a much later image, not from 25, when Hitler really was a marginal figure and of not much significance like to begin with. But Hindenburg is brought in, and with him already, and of course he's a staunch monarchist, right? He is like enshrining all, if you almost wish, anti-Republican, anti-Weimar Republic kind of values, offered. So he's coming from a Junker family, so landed aristocracy. He's of course the war hero in the eyes of many in the World War I. He's like the co-head of the Third Supreme Command from 1916 to 1918, right? So in a way responsible for the loss, but of course, of the war. But this is of course also then turned upside down. So you have somebody who's willing, right, of course, not to cooperate at all with the left, especially not the far left. And the mere fact that he is again voted in, though he doesn't really want to run again in 1932, supported by the Social Democrats, of course, irks him to the degree that he's not even supported by fellow military men and officers and organizations that he really considers more of his own. They actually start out as their own candidate, then later withdrawn. But nonetheless, so these are, of course, some of the key dynamics that are already kind of coming in play. And of course, you see then the president not hesitating to, in fact, use the emergency decrees, of course, prompted now by the Nazis and others. That's, of course, the key one to keep in mind. Of the first one was the new government. So look at the date, of course, we're talking end of February of 1933. This one, in fact, is the infamous, if you wish, decree of the Vice President for the protection of people and state. Again, of course, the lingo is propagandistic through and through. It suspended the civil liberties set by the Constitution, freedom of expression, of the press, of public assembly, of the right of free association. So it gives the new government, a minority government, by the way, of course, led by Hitler, all kinds of mechanisms, as the previous governments before were also, in fact, minority governments, both the ones held by von Schleicher and also von Papen were along the similar lines, and even the one from Brüning, of course, as I already mentioned, directly there. And of course, this is only pushed then, further with the so-called enabling law, the textbook, image that number of you are, of course, familiar, in which now then, after the successful, somewhat successful election of March 5th. In fact, the Nazis now push, you see Hitler at the podium there, to push through the enabling law with a 2/3 majority to govern for 4 years without parliament. Of course, again, much debate, the legality of it or whatsoever. It's, of course, again, a propaganda image. What you don't see is that the entire building is surrounded by SA, that the communist deputies, of course, are no longer there. They're already imprisoned in many ways. So it's always a story also of violence. Here is not a textbook, image going directly in this distinct direction. We see, of course, I'm going to take a break, from the screen share, of course, in a minute, that the overall party system, where you don't have a 5% hurdle, or you have like a massive number of parties, 60,000 votes in a certain district will get you already a seat. So you can imagine how many distinct fractures, more than 30 parties in certain occasions, were represented. And you see, of course, if you go down the development here, 32, you see, in fact, right, Nazi party here, on the other hand, Communist Party, for the first time gaining the majority on the national level. So Nazi Party and Communist Party, both distinctly anti-Weimar Republic, now gain the upper hand, and you have a situation as of the summer of 32, in which, in fact, anti-democratic, anti-Weimar Republic parties are in the majority, and of course then can manipulate and do manipulate, of course, the various mechanisms of parliament to, in fact, end pretty much all functionality. So even when the new chancellor comes in, the presidential cabinet, von Papen, they are ready to strike immediately with Göring at the head of parliament to force him to kind of resign. So he, in fact, dissolves in this overall context parliament before they can oust him in many ways here as well. So these are, of course, part of the distinct dynamics. The other one, of course, is because we really have to talk about a dual political and economic crisis, is, of course, the distinct economic developments, which are only going to talk about for like a few seconds here too, in the overall context of the world economic crisis that sits in the 1929, in fact, hits Germany exceptionally hard, of course, with an unemployment rate in 1932, by late 1932, of 5.7 million. Well, of course, if you include, in fact, fully or even partially unemployed, we're talking then more than 8.7 million. And this is nothing shy of half of the workforce. I repeat, half of the workforce. So, of course, devastating overall consequences. And this is, of course, in the broader context of already a major economic crisis with hyperinflation in 1923, which was, of course, not so much the doing of the Weimar Republic. This is, in fact, an ongoing, pretty much caused and pushed even further by the war already. So beginning in 1914, but certainly coming then to new heights in 1923 for a number of reasons. Again, we can discuss, if you like, in the synchronous session here as well. So we have the reality of the dual crisis. The importance, of course, again, is that only because there's an economic crisis, even as grave and devastating as this one, doesn't necessarily mean, right, that a Hitler government is a foregone conclusion. If anything, there are numerous models that you might also imagine. The Communist Party, of course, is on the rise. Potential, though of course not realistic, of going together with other parties, organizations on the left in the labor movement, that of course is split since 1919. Or of course a more authoritarian model, or of course even a return to the monarchy or whatsoever. So there are really numerous scenarios that are playing out and that are more or less realistic in this overall context. So to simply say, well, economic crisis, i.e. rise of the Nazis, not so much, though, of course, is an important equation overall. So let's look at a few other factors before wrapping up, and also, of course, taking the youth more into equation, as, of course, I had already pointed out. So let me actually share again. So here we have one of the classic interpretations by Lipset, right? So the extremism of the middle, right? The important social change that is taking place, right? That the middle classes are put under enormous strain, are in fact pushed into poverty precisely, and of course not just with the economic crisis of 29 following, but already the earlier one mentioned right here, and that the radicalism, so Lipset and others in this vein would argue then benefit radical parties, especially, of course, the Nazi Party in this overall reading. So that's a thoughtful kind of reading overall. It doesn't really pan out in the now empirical material that we have at our disposal now, kind of decades later. It's kind of goes back more to the 1960s, and we have distinct phenomenon that in fact shows that the Nazi Party in and of itself was, and that's quite striking, one of the early, in fact, People's Party, Volkspartei, in Germany, like nowadays the Christian Democrats, Merkel's party, would lay claim to. So prior to that, you had all the various parties, right? The Center Party, catering to mostly the Catholic, in fact, voters, Social Democrats, of course, to the Social Democratic kind of milieu and part of the labor movement, etc., but no longer kind of reaching out across like class, political, cultural lines. But the Nazi Party actually succeeds in this overall strategies, gradually, not evenly by any stretch of the imagination. But what you see is, in fact, not simply support by disenchanted members of the middle class or former middle class or whatsoever would support the party. You have, in fact, a broad sway also among the youth. Finally, of course, and we're going to talk about more before wrapping up here. In a few minutes, and that not just, in fact, among impoverished youth and working class or whatsoever, especially those not part of social democratic or communist milieus, but also, in fact, the more highly educated among students. For example, the Nazi Party by the end of the 1920s, early 1930s is doing quite well at university as well as like secondary school and the like, and numerous developments, of course, that are important to take then into consideration. It's also, in fact, next point then, an overall situation in which you have a republic without, and there's kind of paraphrasing Herzing, who was the head of the Reichsbanner Schwarz-Rot-Gold, so paramilitary organization in support of the republic, close to the Social Democrats. Herzing was a Social Democrat who coined the broader phrase of we're having, in fact, a republic without Republicans, nothing with the American lingo, please, but in the context of supporters of the Weimar Republic, of course. And with that, he, of course, raises a critical, important point that we already saw, of course, with Hindenburg, certainly not a Republican by any stretch of the imagination, at the helm of the political system. But of course, that goes throughout, various renditions. And just some examples here are parts of the political elite. You see, in fact, Hugenberg, who is the head of the DNVP, a much stronger party, of course, but the beginning of the Republic then. By the early 1930s, not a popular politician, quite the opposite, but nonetheless an influential one, becomes the head of the DNVP, of course, the coalition partner of the Nazis later on. In 1928, he's also in charge of much, in fact, of the right-wing media landscape, newspapers, even with shares in UFA, so film production, so hugely influential. I don't want to draw any Murdoch references or whatsoever, but certainly quite influential. In his own right, you have also the people in uniform. These are not active military officers for the most part. These are veterans. This is the Stahlhelm, the largest veteran organization with Zelte kind of running. Here they form like the Harzburg Front against the Weimar Republic and in support, in fact, of the Young Plan we're going to talk about. No, a referendum against it, rather, support of the Young Plan, of a referendum against it, and so kind of throughout. So here, of course, anything but any support or love for the Republic, quite the opposite. The same goes also, it's important to note, for the army. So the Reichswehr shrunk to 1,000, of course, and certainly not coming to the support of the Republic, not during the Kaplitwitz Putsch in 1920, when, in fact, that's the quote here, Sieg, the head at the time, kind of declares like Reichswehr doesn't shoot at Reichswehr. So there was some, in fact, revolt bringing down the system. Members of the Reichswehr and other monarchists, sympathize, in fact, trying to topple the government, which fails, but it fails because of a mass strike launched by the left-wing unions and the labor movement kind of and the like. It really brings it kind of to an end. But you have really the military that continues to play a dubious role, even long before they're infiltrated by Nazi kind of members or even turned into a Nazi-fied army in the 1930s. You have to just think about like how the last chancellor prior to Hitler comes to the fall. So von Schleicher, who is actually a high-ranking member of the Reichswehr itself. And he is kind of kicked out unconstitutionally with the support of the army in regard at least to the office he's holding as the war minister, right? So, and in order to do that, you need, in fact, by the constitution, the support of the chancellor, which he had in the same person, so a personal union. So wouldn't have given it, but nonetheless, kind of ignoring it, the officer Blomberg, who's brought in to then distinctly kind of replace him, ignores it anyhow. And it's a broader tendency tendency that you have in the army. There were very, very few high-ranking officers, Reinhardt being one, who supported the Republic for the most part, in fact, again, as part of the broader in fact, example of the army going against the Weimar Republic in and of itself. So finally, of course, you have a set of ideological factors. Strong nationalism, of course, is all too obvious, right? The legacy of the lost war, the stab in the back, in fact, legend, one has to say. So here, in fact, it is depicted in an image that some of you might be using in the classroom. If not, you might want to consider kind of using it. So Germans think of it. It's a postcard from 1924. I don't want to kind of spend much time on the visual analysis. Everything is kind of striking, quite obvious. You have like the front line that is still holding despite of their approaching tanks. You have, in fact, here Scheidemann, right, the first chancellor, social democrat, with a knife kind of stabbing the army kind of in the back. And of course, the figures right here, revolutionary, and those, of course, are all the visual imagery of anti-Semitism that also, in fact, Professor Birnbaum will talk about in extenso on Sunday. So the broader context here, of course, being that in the context of explorations in the Reichstag, various exploratory commissions of what happened right at the end of the war, in which Ludendorff, so is the co-head of the Third Supreme Command, along with Hindenburg, former one, right, testifies that, in fact, no, the army was victorious, was never defeated, but was, in fact, weakened from the back by social democrats and others. That's, of course, here the visual depiction of it. Mind you, of course, that nothing was further from the truth, and that the same Ludendorff in October of 1918 had urged the parties, the emperor and the like, to immediately go and file for an armistice, because he could not guarantee that the front lines would hold for even a few more weeks, and that he would predict that the victorious Entente forces would be marching into Germany and into Berlin if that wouldn't be taking place. Nonetheless, not so much the question of what is factually accurate, but of course how it is instrumentalized politically, and that of course was done so in this enormous success. The other one I want to briefly allude to is, of course, the vexing issue of reparations that you often kind of see, and also here, also in textbooks still spelled out. It's so crippling or whatsoever. Crippling, not so much in reality. In fact, the German chancellors, even Brüning, and later then from Papen, Mr. Lausanne Conference of 32, were quite successful in actually ending reparation payments prematurely. And the reparations that were paid, and of course they were paid, also was financed by numerous loans or whatsoever, many coming from American banks, among others. So the reality was not as harsh, but the propaganda impact was absolutely devastating. And here's an image of the anti-Young plan, the Young plan being introduced in 1929 in much better conditions, in fact, than the one of the Dawes plan of 24, but nonetheless, it was instrumentalized kind of immediately. You see, of course, the harsh images here as well, instrumentalized immediately by, in fact, the far right. So at 59 or even 69 years of payment here, 2.5 billion, again, much better terms. And in the end, of course, they were not paid. But the important part is they were instrumentalized. The Nazis also jumped on board here, as well as the junior partner of the campaign that was unsuccessful, but nonetheless giving them some more credibility in right-wing circles at the end of the 1920s. So what you have then here, and like a few more factors before coming to an end, are some other factors that we'll need to take into consideration to, in fact, explain the distinct developments here. And one is, in fact, again, the overall prevalence of authoritarian traditions in Germany, but not as crudely as you might think. Peukert, quite distinctly, also unfortunately deceased far too early, overall coined it the totalitarian temptation. So waiting for a Führer. So give me like one image here that kind of enshrines it in many ways already. So we have that distinct emphasis here of desire for a highly personalized leadership and also leadership state. You have in many ways images of the engineer, the leader, the strong, healthy man in this regard. But if you take a closer look at this image here, right, and I sometimes use this for my students, some immediately jump and say, yes, of course, like this person is a Nazi leader, or I don't see the swastika, but that just might like how it is or whatsoever. No, maybe some of you have already recognized him. Depicted here is Ernst Thälmann. Ernst Thälmann is, of course, at this point, the head of the Communist Party, and since 1925, also the chairman of the Rote Frontkämpferbund, which is the communist paramilitary organization right here. So what you see with this, and that's why I kind of pull it up here, is of course not to then subscribe to some crude version of totalitarian theories or whatsoever. Some of you might think it's more valuable or helpful whatsoever. We can discuss it too in a synchronous session, of course, if you like. But in fact, the pervasiveness of those distinct thought systems here, right, even the longing for Volksgemeinschaft, for people's community, which of course would look quite differently in the Nazi rendition of it. But that, of course, is not just simply limited to the Nazi party or the right, but really crosses like party, political, cultural, whatever kind of lines, even then on the far left of the spectrum. Here's probably the image you more suspected, and I talked about in fact, the distinct like totalitarian temptation altogether. This, of course, is a party poster, very different from electioneering in Germany at the time, which is borrowed, interestingly enough, from American election campaigns brought to the party by some of its supporters who spent a few years in the United States. So we have that distinct notion. Of course, I would fall short if I wouldn't be addressing the overall issue of psychology and also, propaganda, maybe again a little differently than what you might expect. So we have, of course, right, propaganda images, what you might expect. Here's, of course, Goebbels, his paper, The Angriff. He was the head of the Nazi party district kind of in Berlin, which was not a Nazi stronghold, especially not in the 1920s or early 1930s. But I don't really want to kind of reiterate like the older line of Goebbels as the propagandist par excellence or whatsoever. There are certainly kind of clear limitations here. You have Hitler giving a speech in Berlin in April of 1932. In fact, they were electioneering, and that was in fact part of the campaign for president, which of course that is important to note. Hitler lost. He got 36%, in the second round, coming in quite clearly behind, in fact. Hindenburg, and losing this distinct vote. You see kind of Goebbels on his heels kind of precisely here. And while of course there was some success kind here and some success also of Nazi propaganda and the Deutschlandflüge by airplane and all of that, there were certainly clear kind of limitations also of the type of electioneering and propaganda. And of course it wasn't just limited to, in fact, the Nazi party itself, but of course other were also quite successful in propaganda here. In fact, you have the two left parties precisely, right? So the KPD, the Communist Party on the right, and on the left that of the Social Democrats. Mind you, of course, right, that the Social Democrats also go as much against the communists and Moscow as they're going against the monarchists, as they're going against the Nazis, which of course, spells one of the key factors also for the rise the success of a Nazi-led government, because the left, right, the labor movement remains kind of split. And again, the reasons for that we can discuss during the synchronous session here as well. So propaganda to an extent. One might think, what is the importance of anti-Semitism and propaganda? Also hotly debated for a while. Historians downplayed or even rejected it. Now some more important recent work by Alheim and others indicates much more of a prevalence. But again, many people voted for the Nazis, not because they were anti-Semitic, but in some cases even despite the fact, and deliberately so. So that too is much more of a complexity that we might want to explore here too. So finally, of course, as the factor here, the role of individual kind of actors in the broader equation. And that kind of leads us to important readings by Henry Ashby Turner, Yale professor, very influential kind of back in the day, and numerous others, of course, following in his footsteps, who would in fact stress the role of distinct politicians in bringing, in fact, the Nazis to power in this broader context. And here, of course, what is important, again, is to see the distinct context that, in fact, will have and the Nazis are facing, despite, of course, Nazi propaganda, despite, of course, the way in which it's sometimes taught. The Nazis, of course, despite the election success at the Reichstag election in July of 1932, of course, on a steep decline in the second half of 1932. So in many ways, it is the consequence, I would argue, with Ian Kershaw, not so much of Hitler's or Goebbels' strength or whatsoever, or an upward trajectory of the party, but rather the consequence of the action of others that bring the party to the chancellorship and then to the basis of building a dictatorship. And what we have, in fact, here is like a set of defeats, right? So even after the success of Hitler's party in July at the Reichstag election, he is rejected, rebuffed, right, when he's trying to get the chancellorship in August of 1932. He, in fact, even in that election process, 2/3 of the Germans are not voting for him. And in fact, if you look at the later elections in 1932 in Thuringia, for example, in December, a state in which the Nazis were quite successful a few years earlier, the losses are staggering, 40% losses for the Nazi party there. So you have a party that is really on edge. You have internal upheaval, among others, in December of 1932, revolts also within the SA again. And Hitler actually goes around talking about, I'll finish myself off with a bullet if it comes to that. So it's really not a party from strength that we have here. So it's in many ways one of those ironies. So this is where then Turner comes in with this distinct reading explanation of looking, in fact, at other distinct figures. And here, the maybe two most important one, like Franz von Papen himself, Chancellor, of course, of the Cabinet of Barons, who doesn't have any even sliver of support that von Brüning still had as a presidential cabinet. He is, however, a close friend of Hindenburg's, which really helps in this overall context, a relatively small kind of circle right there. The person next to him, and also in the close-up on the right, is Kurt von Schleicher. The chancellor, the last one prior to Hitler, whom I already mentioned, who has his own distinct way and solutions to offer in this overall context, the so-called Querfront, so trying to shave off some support from the Nazis, even getting one of the Strassers to join the government, then even with the Social Democrats and others who all rebuff him at some point. He even reproaches kind of Hitler, if he can just stay as then Minister of Defense in this overall context. It all doesn't come to fruition, it all kind of falls by the wayside here as well, and he is finally then kicked out, not even getting over the first kind of hurdle that he is set out to be. So we have then von Papen, in fact, who then intrigues in the months of January with numerous other conservatives kind of supporters, and then kind of pioneers in many ways that government led by Hitler, which of course in the broader conception that he would be, despite this chancellor role, still only a minor figure. And the von Papens and others, Hugenbergs, could be calling the shots in the overall causes, of course, a vast kind of miscalculations. Now, of course, just one caveat before then wrapping up for sure is, of course, I don't want to push this distinct reading here too far either, and certainly not apply that individuals, like as idiosyncratic as they might be, as von Papen or whatsoever, were the ones really to, serve as the key explanation for the rise then of Nazis or whatsoever. Certainly anything but the useful or popular kind of politicians. These, of course, were all part, right, of their own habitus, of their own socialization, of their own different social and political groups and leaning, and of course they were also hemmed in by structural factors or whatsoever. So I'm certainly not proposing, a distinct reading here of history as kind of made by, white, heterosexist, overpowering and all influential kind of men, this overall context to bring Hitler to power, quite from it. But again, it's an important part of the broader kind of reading and understanding that we have at the forefront of these distinct readings. So with that, let me actually share one last time. So we have, of course, other important connections here. Of course, is Hitler and Hindenburg, with Hindenburg's grandson Neudeck, right? So it's after he's already been made. So that's, of course, the important connection that Hindenburg finally overcomes this reluctance, right? Hitler, of course, was an absolute nobody, not an aristocrat, like not even officer rank during the war and stuff like that. But that resistance is overcome over the years, and none other than the president's son, Oscar von Hindenburg, depicted here, is partially won over, right? The son of the president that jokingly was always referred to as like not having really a formal position in the constitution, but in reality, of course, had, and of course, a detrimental one for it. So he, in various meetings also in January of 1933, is gradually kind of won over and supports, in fact, the appointment of Hitler as chancellor. So also, in fact, an important role in the broader process here and equation. So let's wrap up, and I talked a little bit, but not really all that much, of course, about the role of the youth and young voters and young supporters here. And what you see with the flags here is, of course, the Hitler Youth marching in 1932. At this point, already quite a sizable organization like the Nazi Party itself, like rising from just a few dozen in 1919 to like 60,000 and plus by 23, and then of course then towards the end of the 20s or in 30s we're getting close to the million mark overall, and of course in the various other organizations rising along with it. So the Weimar Republic, and that's important, maybe one last time. That's important, of course, here it's in many ways one that kind of breathes the mystique of the youth. It breathes the mystique of the youth more than even the empire and others for a number of reasons. A, we have a steadily declining birth rate. That's currently part of the anxiety and the discussions that are pervasive. You also at the very same time have, at least for a last time, between those born between 1900 and 1910, still relatively high at this point, and also coming then into the labor market age 15 and up to kind of 25. But of course, then emerging in 1925, in which the economy is under enormous strain. So there's certainly the losers of the economic process, lots of also generational kind of infighting, precisely right because there are no more positions, there's not enough employment whatsoever available. And the same, of course, is true not just in manufacturing, but also, of course, in academia and also in the higher echelons kind of society, precisely where there can't be any positions for the younger generations. But of course, also leading them to strive. So in many ways, the young people for Weimar politicians emerge more and more as conspicuous, as dubious. So there are numerous ways in which the Weimar Republic, which was an enormous social experiment in many ways, with numerous promises of welfare support and unemployment and all kinds of benefits unseen in German history, also in an extent, and introduce, in fact, in 1922, the Reich Youth Welfare Law, also benefiting, in fact, the youth. The other reality is that among the 9 million youth in the Weimar Republic, about 4.3 are organized, so a relatively high degree of organization in church clubs, in clubs associated to various parties, the DNBP as the Bismarck Youth, and the Communist Party as the Kommunistische Jugendverband, and numerous others, and of course independent organizations that already existed prior to the Weimar Republic, like the Wandervogel, right, the Birds of Passage, an independent organization that was supported by teachers, is then radicalized and more nationalized in the course of the war, and certainly also anti-Weimar for the most part. So you have that, and certainly also then final points before really coming to an end, certainly also, of course, it's the image again of the Hitler Youth, right? So that also is coming into being. There's a number of smaller organizations in 1922, the Nazi Party, the early one, even the one led by Hitler already, is not really all that keen, despite, of course, the image of the Nazi Party as the party of youth, or the youthful party in the early stages, at least. That kind of changes by the late 1920s and 26, and the Hitler Youth Organization is kind of reorganized, and then by by 1930, you certainly have the rise also in terms of, in terms of numbers. So like 25,000 boys, 14 and upward, in fact, are organized by 1930 right here. You have, and now we have, as I alluded to earlier, quite some empirical data at our disposal. You see, in fact, that between 25 and 33, there's lots of talk about the old fighters, those who joined the party during the years of the Weimar Republic, but the more fitting term introduced by Jürgen Falter, among others, is that, in fact, of the young fighters. So those between the years of like 70 and up to 20, maybe, in terms of those who joined the party in that stretch. So end of the 1920s, in fact, more like about 49% of that age group, so 17 slightly up, 99% of the male, also no big surprise here in many ways, and the overrepresentation of lower classes, as well as also some elites, as I mentioned earlier, from university students, but also public schools, precisely here as well, who then join not just the youth, but also, of course, the party later on in and of itself. That's also, of course, speaking to the importance of youth support. But again, it would be misleading to simply say, well, it's all the youth supports the Nazis, and that's the end of it. Here, in fact, we have a gathering in Baden of the Sozialistische Arbeiterjugend that came into being in 1922, and the youth organizations of the SPD and USPD kind of merged. Also a very important organization that, the two wings here, more than 100,000 members. Early on, these are certainly in support of the Weimar Republic and of the distinct parties. So we have a more complex story as far as the youth support is concerned. The youth, of course, brought overall to more prominence in the Weimar Republic, but of course also to increased marginalization. So now really coming to an end, what we then have, so why did the Republic collapse? So why were the Nazis brought to power? Really a complex scenario of various factors. I, in fact, analyzed a number of them for you, some more critically, as you, of course, noticed, some not. Of course, you can all take your own clues and positions and come to your own distinct opinion kind of it. It's overall and still less of the strength of the Nazi movement and the Nazi leadership, I would argue, than those numerous other factors that I again elaborated on. It's also, of course, also broader inside this very factor of, in fact, for the study of the durability and also the strength of liberal democracies. Right? There is, of course, also the lack of the broader support and unraveling of institutions and the like of the Republic without Republicans that are important factors in fact, the demise of these distinct systems. And of course, as far as the youth support is concerned, certainly important for also the rise of the Nazi party as the useful movement and the factors I just, again, briefly alluded to. But again, here too, a mixed bag in which, of course, you have also considerable youth support also for the Republic, also, in fact, against the Nazis in and of itself, and also, of course, numerous prospects, not just by welfare legislation, but also by schooling that is drastically changed and becomes less authoritarian, especially at the upper levels, in this kind of broader context here, despite, of course, the prominence of Nazi organizers and the like also among students. So overall, that concludes then the pre-recorded presentation here. I'm very much looking forward to, of course, discussing some of those factors in our session on Monday. So for now, of course, thank you again for participating. Thank you again for listening, and thank you for and looking forward to a constructive and fruitful week with all of you. Thank you very much.